or physical positions. And in an attempt to come up with a neural correlate approach of this, we've developed what I think is a new EEG paradigm. I'm kind of excited about it, and I think it has, there's potential that I'm still wrapping my head around understanding how it might ultimately be used. So the long-term goal of this, and I think what this paradigm potentially allows us to do, is track the locus of attention in a task through a task irrelevant signal. And in our first attempt to apply this, it's to get after this perceptual or physical coordinate systems. And it's basically rooted in the frequency tagging technique. I'm going to just sort of walk by the basic idea, and I'm going to apologize for the really low quality graphics here. The basic idea is to have some form of a background field flicker at a given rate. And so in the two videos I sent out, you'll sort of see more specific examples of what this is, but you have some background, and then that background flickering is going to generate some distribution of frequency tags that can be detected at the scalp. And so the basic idea is we can present some target stimulus, or you perform some task, or both, superimposed on this flickering background. And so, for example, you could have condition A, whatever it is, and while condition A is on the screen, this is going to generate some distribution of frequency tags, the background is. And now I present condition B, and I get some other distribution of frequency tags from the background. And the basic idea would be to do some analysis comparing the distributions of these frequency tags.
Whose sound is generating all that noise?
Yeah, we're getting some feedback from somewhere.
That's David.
So our first crack at applying this is in the double drift stimulus. So as you will recall, drifting motor is going to translate back and forth along a 45-degree diagonal. And if you get your drift speeds sort of appropriate, and while it's doing that, here I can try to see what I can, hang on. The background is going to flicker. So as it's translating, the background is going to flicker, and those two YouTube links will give you an idea of what that looks like. And so if you were to look in the YouTube videos, trial 1 and trial 2, and fixate the lower left corner of the screen, in one of the videos, the Gabor will appear to be drifting up and down. In the other video, the Gabor will appear to be drifting left to right, horizontally. And so basically what we're going to do is look at the distribution of frequency tags to that background as a function of that or horizontal. And what's nice about this is that fundamentally, the physical position of the Gabor is obviously the same across the two conditions. So on Tuesday, I was the guinea pig, and I sat in front of the monitor for 40 minutes. Got these.
David, Gideon, yeah. Gideon, hang on a sec. Hey, David, can you mute your microphone?
Oh, the sounds of silence. Well done, Jamie. So I'm going to just give a caveat. I want to give a lot of credit to Thaisa, who is our newest graduate student. She hasn't actually even started yet. And so She'll be starting in spring semester in January. But for the last month, she's had to learn Psych Toolbox, learn all of our EEG stuff, learn the frequency tagging analysis. And so she's been cranking really hard. And we made these graphs yesterday. So this is extremely preliminary, and I'll give some caveats as I show them. So here's the distribution of the 15 hertz. So we flickered that background at 15 hertz, and this is the distribution of the frequency tags across the electrodes. And what I just want to point out, you see this donut-shaped pattern, and this is an effect of the way we're doing the referencing of the electrodes. And so in this preliminary version, the reference of the array is the top of the head. And so you would expect smaller signals for adjacent electrodes, for the electrodes that are close to that reference. Typically, we would re-reference to the average, and you'd see a more sort of modeled pattern. But in general, what we see is a very, very strong frequency tag at 15 hertz. And there is some distribution across the electrodes when it's horizontal. And now when we look at the vertical, again, you see this donut-shaped pattern. But what I'm going to do is just sort of toggle between the two. And what you see is they're not exactly the same. That's really the key take-home message. They're qualitatively similar, which I think is very to be expected, given that this is, the squares in the upper right quadrant. And these are, small perceptual things. But my hunch is, if this were consistent across subjects, we could demonstrate that these are separable signals using MVPA, if not even just univariate analyses. We can look at the second harmonic at 30 hertz. For whatever reason, for us, this was a much smaller signal, and so it's more modeled, and I'm not quite sure what to make of this at this point. But here's the 30 hertz horizontal, and here's the 30 hertz vertical. And again, I don't want to make too much, but again, these look different from each other. Now, it could be that this is the 30 hertz, this could be a very, very low signal to noise ratio, so I don't want to make too much of a deal out of it. But the take-home message is that although the physical stimulus is virtually identical, we seem to be able to get a neural correlate of, at the very least, the percent, n of 1. We have a very long way to go with this. There could be lots of reasons why we get a differentiable signal. It could just be all eye movements. It could be, who knows what it is. But in the big picture, what we want to do is dissociate attention. Is this attention or is this perceived position? I think both of these are interesting questions. And we want to be able to dissociate these. And so one of the things that we would like to have is the frequency tag for the Gabor itself, because the Gabor itself is drifting, and it's going to generate a frequency tag. And we've peeked at the data, and we think we have it. We're seeing a spike in the frequency domain at 10 hertz, which we think corresponds to the I guess it would be the temporal frequency of the Gabor, but we kind of need to double check our code and verify that we should be expecting 10 hertz. But it's something that we could get. And so we ought to be able to have two distinct signals, one that's the background and one that's the Gabor itself. And then what I think we need to do is have sort of control conditions where we have physically vertically moving Gabors and physically horizontally moving Gabors that aren't illusions. And we'd want to have, for example, explicit attention tasks that are on the vertical edge of the square or the horizontal edge of this square. And you could train a classifier on these sort of physical / attentive conditions and then test during the double drift stimulus. And you say, is the distribution of these frequency tags either for the Gabor or the background more like the attentional signals that we see or more like the physical signals? And so I think it's promising, but there's a long, long way to go to really have something conclusive on this. And I'm going to hand off to Patrick because I think he's going to present some behavioral data, which for this specific thing may kind of make our approach a little obsolete. But anyway, I think the paradigm is very interesting as a generalized approach for tracking, potentially tracking where things are or how things change as a function of perceived. We could do this for various illusions and tracking attention. So I think that's my last slide. And I guess what I do is ask if anybody has any questions on this specifically, and then I'll pass it off to Patrick.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I thought where you were going to go with this was to have several different frequencies in the background, and where the Gabor would seem to, be on one background, but it would actually be on a different background.
Right. So that was the original approach that Patrick and Siri were going to try, and I still think there may be merit in that, and I think that's something that we may also want to code up and try. I think the challenge was that perceptually, you get this sort of paradoxical percept where although the Gabor looks like it's, say, moving vertically, it never gets into that background patch. And that was one of the reasons why I said, well, let's put this on a single background. And I think the advantage, I guess the advantage I see of our approach is that instead of relying on the relationship between two frequency tags, I can be agnostic as to what the effect of attention or the percept is on any given electrode. Maybe the frequency tag should go up. Maybe the frequency tag should go down on this electrode, and rely more on that spatial distribution across the scalp.
Yeah, I have a question too.
Yeah.
I think that's an awesome technique, and I like that there's only a single flicker frequency and it covers the whole background. I think when you're looking at the amplitudes across the different electrodes, you might be, or maybe you haven't, but you might be ignoring one of the most important sources, which is the relative phase in each electrode. I think as the target or the attention moves from location to location, maybe the biggest effect will be on the relative phase of the frequency tag on each electrode.
Yes, and yes. And that's a very standard thing, and that's something we have a little toolbox for looking at phase. This comes from Tony's they call it the T-circ, okay, where you can do these, polar coordinate significance tests. So yes, but yeah, we need a little bit more time. Give us another couple days.
Well, that's great.
And in fact, and I think one of the places we may see those phase differences the most might be on the target, because, of course, the direction of the drift changes between the vertical and the horizontal, and that may be most detectable in the target.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool.
Did you try this without the flickering background at all? Just, comparing the two cases?
We have N of 1 that we got on Tuesday morning. But there's lots to do. Now that we have the basic code in place, we can start, aggressively trying any and all the above kind of thing. So we've now, we need to finish the analysis pipeline, but we've gotten over the big hurdle, which is figuring out how to code up the flicker and the drifting and stuff.
So do you remember that Ed DeYo MRI study where he said, I can decode where you're attending?
I know where you're attending.
Something like that, yeah. And has anybody done anything like that with EEG?
So there was a very nice poster at VSS, I don't know if it's been published yet, by John Sorensis's group, where they do MVPA. and show that you can decode position and the identity of the item that's being attended. And I think we could do something very similar to that, except using the frequency tag technique. I think we could probably get much better signal to noise. And there is a potential advantage that we might be able to do this in a task irrelevant fashion. And so, I could have you doing a non-attentive task, just present you various stimuli and possibly be able to decode where you're attending.
I thought the eds at Chicago were working on this, but
maybe it's the eds and not John Strensis. But yeah, there is a very nice poster. I can send it out to the group. But they're using VEPs. So it's single trials, and they're able to show the time course of the MVPA over time. And of course, we're not using the time course. But I do have, I had this sort of vision of picture a series of RSVP streams along a clock face. And those RSVP streams are all going at one specific rate. And, I have you attending to one or, systematically attending to different ones. And can we look at this distribution of frequency tags and be able to decode where you're attending? And then, of course, that would be a task relevant target. But I could also have, for example, a flickering annulus that these things are superimposed on that's flickering at another rate and have a task irrelevant signal. And look at this. So I think the answer to your question is yes, and I think we can do it also and maybe better.
But the question you're trying to answer is whether attention is going to the real position or the perceived position. Is that correct?
Well, that's the question Patrick wants to answer. And I think it's worthy of answering. And we might be able to use this to try to answer it. I think like I said, we have a long way to go before we could really convince ourselves that yes or no. But I think the basic technique may have other applications above and beyond this specific question.
And what is the question that you're going to answer?
I think this technique potentially can be used to answer where is attention, or can I identify neural correlates of phenomenology, right? So here's an example. Maybe this difference is a neural correlate of the perceived position. And these are very high signal to noise ratio signals, which are amenable to source localization. And so you say, where is this frequency tag coming from in the brain? Or where is the differentiable frequency tag coming from in the brain? And so I'm not really sure the full extent of how we could use the technique. But I think there's potential here.
Gideon, how
Yes.
narrow are the peaks in the frequency tag peaks in the spectra?
Spectacular. So these were 10-second trials. So our frequency resolution is 1/10 of a hertz. And these are this is within 1/10 of a hertz. So it's a single spike. So at 15 hertz, you get a spike. At 15.1 hertz, you get nothing. At 14.9 hertz, you get nothing.
So you really could get a lot of tags on the screen at the same time.
You can if you had like 1,000 hertz monitor. I mean, the challenge is,
Yeah.
right, it's all in the frame refresh.
Right.
And so one possibility, and something I'm actually quite interested in doing, is coming up with like an LED display that's just has various apertures on it. And
well, you could use the ProPix that we had that goes to 1440 hertz.
that would be fantastic. Yeah.
What does that cost?
30,000.
Yeah.
But Fenderich here has a 1,000 hertz monitor, right?
Yeah, and it weighs 1,000 pounds. And but yeah, I mean, but that's the limiting factor, and that's actually one of the reasons why I think the technique is very valuable, because I could in theory do 12 locations with one frequency tag versus 12 locations with 12 frequency tags. And when we did this with our working memory paradigm with 4, you start running into constraints of just how many unique frequencies you can really get.
Right.
And so I think there is some value there just in a practical sense.
Also, one other issue is, yes, you're getting the tenth of a hertz sharpness of the frequency response, but in the stimuli, they're moving over the cortex, moving over the retina, moving over the cortex, and that's going to scramble your phase. So unless you are tracking phase at a shorter time constant, you're going to kind of average phases across all these locations where phase may in fact be the real index.
I really don't know so the phase of the frequency tag is really driven by the flicker. Like, when does it turn white? When does it turn black? When does it turn white? When does it turn black? For the background. And I simply don't know what the impact of having partial occlusion of that square has on the overall measured signal. In terms of the target stimulus, in terms of the drifting Gabor, I don't know the answer to that yet. We haven't looked.
I mean, did somebody do it with smooth pursuit and show, right? So you can keep it stationary in the retina by having the fixation do smooth pursuit.
Well, but even smooth pursuit, you don't have perfect gain, and there's lags, and presumably there's going to be some smearing. And so I don't know. I would say this for the double drift stimulus, over the 10 seconds, it's drifting back and forth in both conditions. And so to some degree, you're getting the same smearing. Whatever smearing of that signal is should be pretty equated across the two conditions. And we make a point of, in fact, we made some effort to make sure that all of the starting locations, the starting position of the Gabor and the starting phase of the Gabor is always the same on every trial for every condition. And so it's to some degree it's matched, I think.
Okay, are you ready to go to the?
Yeah, I'm going to turn off. So over to you, Patrick.
Okay, share screen. Start sharing. Oops, you see anything?
Hello.
Blue.
A lot of blue. Okay, good. Okay, part 2. Gideon kind of gave you everything that was happening already, so I'll just skip over a lot of simple points. The double drift is one example of a motion-induced position shift. There's other simpler ones where you get like motion along a path, and we talked about that in previous ones. You get this extrapolation of about 100 milliseconds. But the double drift is kind of unique. It has internal motion, and its offset seems to build for at least a second and a half. So it's really quite an opening into a new area of sort of visual memory integration, perceptual integration. And the key point, of course, the whole point behind it was you get this huge effect for perception, but not gaze. And that opened up the way to kind of compare perception and saccade-based coordinates. So where and how does attention work? So you got this movie. I'm hoping you've looked at the movie, and if not, you remember what the double drift looks like as it's going up and down. I'm sure on blue jeans it looks pretty terrible. I can't quite see here, so I don't know how terrible it looks, but I'm sure it's very terrible. Anyways, affects perception but not gaze, memory. So what we want to know is attention. So this is just we've fallen on this stimulus thanks to Peter, and it really gives us an opportunity to ask a very basic question, nothing really to do with motion-induced position shifts or anything, but it's our tool to ask whether attention, where is attention? Is attention really part of the saccade system, which a lot of people claim, or is it part of the perceptual system, which sounds like that would be really plausible, doesn't it? We should attend to where we see things. Okay. Now you remember that the double drift had no effect. There's a cursor. Do I get a cursor here? I don't see a cursor. I'm pointing at the screen, but you can't see me pointing. We don't have a cursor. Oh well. Okay. Anyways, you remember that the saccades go parallel to the physical path, not the perceived path, which is vertical there, and that the effect is enormous. The perceptual effect is enormous, and the saccade effect is 0. You also may remember that the cortical recording, done by Sandrine and Fredo on macaque in V1, optical recording, shows no effect of the illusion, no effect of the drift. And you're not going to see much, but I think you remember that whether or not the internal motion is present in the Gabor, the path of activity on V1, just off the fovea down to the left, is virtually identical and quite distinguishable from what the illusion would have been, which is about a 23-degree shift at those speeds and locations. Okay, well, that optical recording is pretty much the same as fMRI, and Surrey showed pretty much exactly the same thing, that there's no discernible difference in the two illusory directions, early visual cortex, although there is, interestingly, in the frontal cortex, which may have something to do with the memory aspect. Okay, so we have something that doesn't show up in early cortex, does show up later. It does show up for perception, but not saccades. Now, you remind you of your Kohler. I don't know how many of you remember him. He's Peter C's student, and he did an fMRI of one of the basic motion-induced position shifts, and did find an effect in V1. I won't go through the details. There's a lot of details. There's some data. But the point behind that was, it appears that what Peter was picking up was the attentional projections, downward attentional projections, saying, hey, attention thinks the stimulus should be here. And so it was detectable. In other words, the fact that you didn't get any detectable early cortical effect in fMRI for the double drift doesn't mean that these illusions don't have an effect in early cortex. Here's one that does. It means that the double drift is special in some way, perhaps in that its attention path is in fact the same as its physical path and not the same as the perceived path. So that's what we want to figure out. And remember that and attention seem to share, spatial attention seem to share a common map. Okay, so here's what, as you remember, Surrey did first. She did the double drift illusion, and it had a perceived endpoint and a physical endpoint, and she flashed little, here's my pointer. Look at that. She flashed little tests and found no effect of the illusion on where the thresholds changed. But the problem with that was, well, weren't sure whether the illusion was actually moving the location of the flash. So that's very important. Is the effort of testing the location being distorted by the illusion itself, or is it a pure measure of location? Okay, so that was nice. Then she dreamt up an SSVP experiment that Gideon has evolved into a better one. So we won't go into that. This one had the 2 flicker fields and had the problem, as you might have seen if you ran the movie, that it's not clear how the illusion is influencing the background flickers. That may or may not work. Gideon will come back to us with something on that. But here's what Surrey then dreamt up along with Kevin Hartstein, using a line motion, illusory line motion as a probe of where attention is located. So some of you know this effect, and maybe even work here on the blue jeans animation, but I sent you a copy in the PDF. So as you remember, there's a flash and then a line. Even though the line is presented all at once, it seems to be drawn out from the flash outwards. So when it flashes on the right, motion seems to be leftward, flashes on the left, motion seems to be rightward. So that's one way to know where some entity, let's call it attention, is located. Peter C here, of course, did some other versions of this without flashes. But this one, we're going to use the flash. And the flash is, of course, not going to be a red flash, but it's going to be the offset of the Gabor stimulus. Now, I hope you looked at this stimulus because in the PDF, because this is the whole thing. And Peter and I sitting here can see it perfectly animated, but you won't. But I assume you looked at it at the PDF. So you're looking at the center. The stimulus goes back and forth a few times. Now its offset is equivalent to that red flash. So when it offsets, then there's going to be a bar presented, boom. And you have to say whether you saw the motion on the bar, if any. Did it go to the left or to the right? Okay, so if you've taken a look at that, you've got your own opinion. But here's some data. The cursor's disappeared again. Oh, maybe it's, okay, anyways. Here's some data. The left-hand two bars are for, the motion here is always vertical up and down. The physical motion is always up and down. The illusion is either present, that's the leftmost bar, or not present, that's the next bar over. And the vertical axis is the percent leftward motion reported. Now notice the flashed bar is aligned to the offset of the up and down Gabor, where it turned off. So if that's where the kind of attention was, or that's where the trigger was, then the motion should be leftward in both of these cases. However, if it's the perceived location that counts, then in the leftmost bar, the motion should have been rightward because it flashes on and it's to the right of the offset, the perceived offset. But notice the data, not much dispute there. Both of them are strongly leftward and not different in any way. And on the right, it's the complementary case where the bar and the illusion is to the right. And here, the percent leftward is low, which means mostly rightward reports. And again, no difference between the illusion case and the non-illusion case. So really suggesting that it's the physical location of the offset that drives the line motion and not the perceived location of the offset. Remember when I said some of the earlier tests were kind of confounded by possibility that the illusion was affecting the measurement probe, which in those earlier cases was a small small test disk. But now we have this flashed bar. And the question is, the subjects were asked in two ways, but here's the data from one way. They're just supposed to say, did the bar flash to the left or to the right of the offset? And basically, there's no difference of the, I see there's a problem here. Okay, anyways, we have another set of data that also show that the test location isn't affected by the illusion. Okay, so that's the summary. I can show you some of those other data if you ask later. If attention uses saccade coordinates, attention may not be allocated to places where we see the object. That's a bit disturbing, but mostly saccades and attention and perception agree, so it doesn't come up much. Matter of fact, may only come up with this one particular very cool stimulus, the double drift stimulus. And what we see here is that maybe attention has different spatial coordinates from perception and quite possibly from visual working memory. So there are a lot of possible openings for deep and interesting questions about attention and how it works and with whom it is working. Okay, so we stop there. Okay, well, we don't have any evidence that attention uses perceptual coordinates.
I have a question about the interpretation of the attentional role in the double drift.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so strong in terms of the perceptual sort of report of the, I guess, the overall directionality of it and so forth. But I mean, maybe the problem has to do with the way we're referring to space in that perceptual aspect of the illusion versus the space for most of these other things, like the source of the transformational apparent motion origin or where the eyes are positioned and so forth. I mean, those spatial coordinates are much more precise than the general impression of upright versus tilted, aren't they?
Yeah. So we made a number of different measurements of this illusion, and the easiest one, of course, is what you say, is the path vertical or oblique, and that's the data I showed you for the 50, 45 degree effect. That's in terms of that orientation. But we have done many other tests as well, where you are either clicking on where you saw the Gabor, or you are pointing to it with your finger, or you are waiting a moment and making a saccade to it. All of those three cases show the illusion.
But could those be all cases of sort of the revisiting an impression and superimposing upon it space after the fact? That is to say, well, I think I saw it angled. It must have been over there. If you know what I mean. In other words, the asking of the question prompts a analysis of whatever sense data you've sort of added to your perceptual experience, and you come up with a new spatial solution, but it's not nearly as direct a probe as these others.
Yeah, you're asking whether the direction effect is the basic component of the illusion, and then you derive position from it. Yes, and we tested that directly by using brief offsets of the trajectory.
Right. That was in the study. I forgot about that one.
Yeah, so we're pretty sure that it is a position effect, and that when you go to point to it, you're pointing to a position that you had seen. Of course, you had seen it, so you might be interrogating a perceptual memory. That's certainly a possibility.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
So
I'm right here.
Well, I'll speak to the mic. Right now you're relying on the offset of the Gabor, which should invoke exogenous attention. And so even if you find that the illusory motion shoots out of the real position, which you find, that might be because of exogenous attention. It would be interesting to also do an endogenous version where, for example, there's a black ring and the thing starts, the drifting Gabor gets occluded by that black ring, and so there's no offset. And then you have the bar appear between those two positions. So it's possible that endogenous attention is in perceptual coordinates, whereas exogenous attention is not. And even within endogenous attention, there's the two types, right? There's endogenous shifts of attention, and then endogenous smooth pursuit of attention. And it's also conceivable that just one of those is in perceptual coordinates. I mean, it's an empirical question.
Well, yeah, if exogenous and endogenous attention had different coordinate systems, that would be pretty awesome. I imagine that both of them are on priority map, which is shared, and just get to it through different paths. So I would be surprised if they had different coordinates. But yes, the test we did was definitely with an offset. To have something that would sort of you're tracking it, and it's inferred location, and then you have a test while it's still hidden, that'd be fine. Or it could, I don't know if you have to hide it at all. You just have a test while it's visible, but not offset. There's no reason to make it hidden. Let's just say the trajectory is still present, but you flash some bars. That seems to be as good as hiding it.
What's the endogenous pursuit you referred to, Peter?
Tracking, attentive tracking.
But yeah. I mean, what's our evidence that that's actually pursuit?
Well, okay, so I mean, I'm using that's probably a word I just made up, right? So I shouldn't do that. But we talk about volitional. There's sort of volitional eye movements, and the two kinds are volitional saccades and volitional smooth pursuit. And I'm making an analogy saying that there's endogenous attentional saccades and endogenous attentional smooth pursuit. And the latter would be, object tracking.
I see, but they're a little different, right? I mean, object tracking without moving your eyes, you're saying.
Yeah.
So there is a moving stimulus.
Sure, but you can have,
attentional. Choose which one is what your point is.
Have attentional saccades without saccading too. I mean, there's this sort of association. So I don't think it's worked out. I think it's an empirical question.
I see, but I get what you're talking about.
So I can speak a little bit to the physical smooth pursuit that Marion and I played around with this several years ago, and in our experience, smooth pursuit follows the physical location, much like the saccades that you've shown, Patrick. It did not seem to track, smooth pursuit did not seem to track perceived, I think, speed. We had something that was modulating in speed.
We did try a version of that too, because we had that same question that you asked, and we were able to get smooth pursuit to follow the perceived location, but only by doing, I don't know if you remember Marty Steinbach's smooth pursuit of two corners. So you're tracking the middle of two corners. He also did bicycle things, but the easiest one is tracking the middle of two corners. So your eyes are not on any, your fovea is not on any physical detail, but you're keeping track of the two locations as they go up and down. And what Matteo did was he made the stimuli with the illusion do kind of a dance like this. Okay, physically they're still going up and down, straight up and down, but perceptually they have this, and the pursuit followed the perceived path, not the physical path.
The only thing I would say to that, because is it Heinlein, who's at Smith Kettlewell?
Yeah.
Had something very similar to that at VSS with a very similar finding.
Oh, that, yes.
And but keep in mind, locally, I thought the smooth pursuit, signal was a motion signal, like an MT signal. Mm-hmm. And locally, there is diagonal motion in the double drift stimulus. Mm-hmm. Right. So the local velocity signals, the veridical local velocity signals are not,
That's true.
And
but I think
there is something about this sort of integrated fixate this center. But there is something I want to ask you, Patrick. It seems that you're conceptualizing the perceived position of the Gabor as independent of underlying space. And I wonder if there could be something of, it's not that the position of the Gabor itself is shifted, it's that space is being warped.
That's very trippy.
Yeah, but I would give, for example, there's this paper by Scott Murray, I think, and Nee, looking at perceived size of targets.
Yes.
And their evidence is that you're shifting the position of these receptive fields, like you're actually warping space, and that's leading to the perceived size change. And there could be something very similar to that going on. And so, in fact, people are making saccades to the perceived position. They are attending to the perceived position. It's just that perceived position has been warped. And I think
that would be very cool. I guess you have to probe the space around the Gabor to see if it's just the Gabor that's shifted or the space that's warped.
Right, and so in watching the video that you sent with the line illusion, I was really trying, you have some data to this, and it seems a little inconclusive. I'm trying to convince myself, is the line moving towards the Gabor or away from the Gabor?
Yeah.
And it's very hard to do that. It's not easy to figure out what that is.
I think that if it's warping, right, you're talking about something like, saccadic compression, right, with an attentional signal. So it would be isotropic. I wouldn't expect it to change the position, only the variance, right? It might change the accuracy of the saccade, but not the mean.
Uh-huh.
Does that make sense?
Well, I'm not sure why it would change the variance of the saccade. If it just shifted space over, I mean, it would change the mean without the variance, I think.
But it's then, the question is the warping some kind of expansion or compression around the endpoint?
Right.
Or is it actually a shear, right, where it's anisotropic?
Right.
And if it's like saccadic compression, then you would expect it to be isotropic. Anyway, I guess it's an empirical question. You'd actually have to figure out a way to measure it.
We have a completely different experiment which asks or answers a bit this question of distorting space. This is with Tanya, unpronounceable last name, in which an object is moving and then crosses a gap instantly and then keeps moving. And when you do that, in fact, you don't see it as going behind an occluder because the speed is infinite. You see it as a gap that is no longer present. You actually see it as continuous motion. And the gap closes and it looks like space has been pulled together and stitched. So certainly maybe the Gabor is doing something like that. That's an interesting proposal. I'm not sure how we test it, and that would be kind of cool.
Maybe we could code up some sort of spiral, rotating double drift and do some retinotopy. And, does the retinotopic mapping shift when you're rotating one direction versus another or something?
Right. I see what you're saying.
Does the basic double drift illusion still work on a patterned background?
Yes, if you have a static textured background, it's just fine.
Okay, and does it influence your perception of that background pattern?
Does the background look like?
Does it look warped? Yeah.
I haven't done it on. I've only done it on kind of random backgrounds. I haven't had a background that would kind of look warped. That's a good test.
Yeah.
That would be certainly easy to do.
Well, there's your and Stuart's groove version of this.
The furrow illusion.
Furrow illusion. So people have to see this. It's pretty cool. Patrick tells me it's identical in Fourier space, but I don't understand that. But basically, you have a bunch of slanted bars in the background and a little gray dot which doesn't have any drift in it, and it moves, say, vertically, and it looks like it moves along those 45-degree furrows. So it's a kind of inverse version of the effect. That actually, you would think as that gray dot in the furrow illusion moved, in fact, over the black and white bars, that it would create a kind of
a wave
flicker. No, that there would be an implicit sort of frequency tag. But then when it moves along,
choose a color to do like the furrow and have it go over the greens or the reds?
You mean like a red-green?
Like a 10 to one or the other, and then have it sort of adapted to the one that you're attending to.
Yeah, Saray was just trying to do that. She wasn't able to get to select out just the red guys or just the green guys. But yes, good point. You mean the red guys going this way, the green guys go that way?
Yeah, whatever you could do to systematically have them both there, but change the